You can go ahead and open your Bibles to John chapter 6. We're continuing our walk throughout the book of John. And this morning we'll be starting in chapter 6. And we're going to be looking at a rather well-known, rather popular encounter of Jesus, with Jesus. If you were to ask the average person who said they knew something about who Jesus was or what Jesus did, I would argue that there are maybe three top things. This includes, of course, him coming to earth and the crucifixion and his ascension into heaven. So three things that happened in his ministry, that these are the most popular things that people most likely, if you were to ask them, do you know what this is? They would say yes. That would be him walking on the water. Another one would probably be the Sermon on the Mount. And then the third one will be what we're looking at this morning, and that is the feeding of the 5,000. We're going to be looking at verses 1 through 15 this morning, and as such, this being a smaller passage, this will be, I'm sure some of you glad to hear, a shorter lesson this morning. And so with that in mind, John chapter 6, verses 1 through 15, what this is really going to be about, of course we know the miracle, but the idea behind that, or what really Jesus is going to show, is that only Jesus can provide, but we cannot. And what this is about trusting who He really is. Now, John 6 is a rather lengthy chapter, and admittedly, it's one of my favorite chapters in all of the book of John, because as Jim and I will go throughout this chapter, you're going to see the feeding of the 5,000, you're going to see the multitudes following Him, but then you're going to see the confrontation because the type of people that are choosing to follow Him. But you're also going to get one of the most powerful statements made by one of Jesus' disciples, to whom shall we go? So John chapter 6 is loaded with very powerful events, but we're going to kick this off in chapter 6 and verse 1. It says, after these things, Jesus went over the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias. Then a great multitude followed him, because they saw his signs which he performed on those who were deceased. And Jesus went up on the mountain, and there he sat with his disciples. Now the Passover, a feast of the Jews, was near. Then Jesus lifted up his eyes, and seeing a great multitude coming toward him, he said to Philip, where shall we buy bread that these may eat? You see, what Philip was about to be presented with was a problem where the situation had a need that was greater than the resources. See, what was going to be asked, really all the disciples are going to be asked this question, is where shall we go to buy bread? You see, the disciples were about to look at this multitude as a problem, as a situation that needed a fix. You see, they had come on the mountain, Jesus' disciples, a great multitude had followed, and it's time to eat. And Jesus looks at the disciples and he says, where are we going to get bread? The disciples are going to look at this as a problem, as a situation, as something that's going to need a fix that they really don't know how to get. The need is going to be greater than the resources. Jesus is going to look at this differently. Now, of course, we know how Jesus is going to look at this. Jesus is going to look at this as an opportunity to show who He really is. So, what this is really going to be is a confliction between the disciples' worry and Jesus trying to teach them to trust. Now, of course, this will be for the disciples, that being what are eventually going to be called apostles, but also those that are following this multitude. But I want you to pay attention to this wording, because this is going to become important for later lessons. Notice why the multitude is following Him. Now, this is going to be important for a later lesson, but I want to go ahead and set the stage for that lesson as well. It will say that the multitudes followed Him. This is in verse 2. This is a great multitude followed Him because they saw the signs which He did. Now this was a people, now I'm not going to judge the hearts of the people that were in this multitude, Now, maybe they were following him and saw the signs that he did because they knew he had to be someone sent from heaven. But you're going to see later in the chapter that a lot of these people that are following because they enjoy seeing the signs and they enjoy getting something out of it. It's what many people in the denominational world call an emotional experience. And so what you're seeing is wherever their heart is in this situation, there's still a great multitude. And this multitude is surrounding Jesus on this mountain, and he looks to his disciples and he says, where are we going to buy bread for these people? Now, we do not know the exact amount of people that were there. We call it the feeding of the 5,000, but most argue that there was more than that. Either way, I have been in audiences that were this size, and let me tell you, trying to figure out where in the world we're going to feed, I would try to feed that many people, is, in my mind, one of the most stressful things that I would have to try to figure out. I have been involved in events, watching them try to get catering orders for only, it was 1,000, I think, and they were trying to figure out catering for that many people. I have never seen people as stressed out as they were trying to cater for 1,000. So here you have Jesus with the multitude that is much larger than 1,000, and he asked his disciples, look, where are we going to provide the food to feed these people? Did Jesus already know the answer to this question? Yes. But what this was about is building the relationship between he and his disciples, because what he was trying to do is to grow the trust between them. What he was trying to do is he was giving them an opportunity. You've already seen the signs that I've done. Remember, these are the same disciples that in John chapter 2 were at a wedding feast and watched Jesus change the molecular structure of water. But here you have them stressing over how are they going to get food. So what you're getting in verses 1 through 5 is you, of course, have to start with something that almost always takes place when Jesus interacts with people. Jesus had compassion on them. You see, he saw the multitude. And so he saw that there was this great amount of people that were following him, and he was concerned about the needs. He saw that they were in need of something. Now, in this case, it was food. Now, Jesus also knew that they were in need of spiritual things, but at this moment in John chapter 6, he was going to attend to their physical needs. Jesus showed a very powerful truth that is very true for evangelism today. And this has always been true, but I've seen it more so when you offer someone food, they're more apt to listen to you giving them spiritual food as well. Inviting someone into your home for dinner opens up doors that otherwise you would not have. But here you have Jesus, and he has 5,000 plus people that are sitting here and they're hungry, but instead of leaving to go find their own food, they've instead decided to stay with the Master on the mountain. And so here you have Jesus looking, and he sees the need and he's concerned, and he looks and he says, where are we going to buy food? And then you get really the crux of this passage, because he is not going to overlook people in need, physically speaking. And we always talk about, Jesus looked out for people's spiritual needs, and that is obviously true. That's why he came to this earth. But he was also not going to overlook their physical needs. Now, he was going to use it as an opportunity to get to spiritual things, but he was going to start with the physical. Okay, but here's the response in verse 6. But this he said to test him, for he himself knew what he would do. He already knew the answer to his question. There's a lot of times in the New Testament, especially when he was talking to his disciples, that Jesus would ask a question that he already knew the answer to. It was one of the ways that Jesus would teach people. He would teach them in questions that he already knew the answer to, but he was asking them these questions because he was trying to push them to grow. They knew he had the capability to feed 5,000 people without needing to go buy food. Is that true? Well, yes. Because these are the same guys, again, that sat and watched a man turn water into wine like that. These were the same guys that were continually watching these miracles unfold. And so Jesus looks to Philip. I don't know why he chose Philip out of everybody, but he chose Philip, and he said, Philip, where are we going to buy food? I don't know if Philip was the one that was with him. I don't know if he just chose Philip out of the guys that were standing there. Either way, he looks to Philip and he says, where are we going to buy food? But this he said, testing him. What he wanted Philip to say was, Lord, we don't have to buy food. But instead, what you get is verse 7. Philip answered him, 200 denarii, or denarii, depending how you want to pronounce that, worth of bread is not sufficient for them, that every one of them may have a little. Basically saying, look, this certain amount of money that we have, it isn't even enough that we could buy a little bit. Like, we could maybe buy some crumbs for 5,000 people, and I don't even know that we could spread it that thin. And then one of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, there is a lad here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 small fish, but what are they among so many? Now I want you to pause. Now what you start with is Jesus asking a question, a rhetorical question really, because he doesn't want them to answer that question. Where can we buy food is not the question he wants them to answer. He doesn't care where you can buy food because they're not going to buy any food. But he's asking this question because he wants a response out of Philip that shows that Philip is really getting it, but he's not. Because he says, Lord, look, he starts focusing on what they don't have. That look, 200 denarii, that wouldn't even be enough to buy crumbs for everybody. When you look at what this is really trying to say, the original language, when he says in verse 7 that every one of them may have a little, the word there, the idea is that if I took a piece of bread and I ripped up a piece and I squished it up, it would be smaller than my fingernail in size. 200 denarii would not have that amount for this amount of people. And so what he was trying to focus on is he was trying to explain to Jesus that we don't have enough. Philip focused on what they were lacking. He was trying to calculate the problem to a financial situation or a physical situation that they had no way to meet. But instead, what Jesus was really wanting him to understand is the power that he had, and he needed him to acknowledge that and realize that. But instead, Andrew focuses on what they don't have. And I want you to picture with me that you have the disciples listening to this discussion between Philip and Jesus. Jesus answers the question and Philip responds like this, and they start getting frantic, like, how are we going to feed 5,000 people? And you have Andrew, and he's kind of looking out, and he sees a boy out there in the multitude. Somehow he saw him, and maybe he was sitting close by. And basically what he has is his mom packed him lunch. That's basically what this is. His mom packed him lunch, and he's sitting here, and he probably had opened it up because he's getting hungry. And so here is this boy with what we would consider like a sack lunch, and he's sitting here with his loaves and his fish, and he's sitting there, and Andrew is like, Jesus, this kid over here, he's got some food, and he's got 5 loaves of bread and a couple of fish, but that's not going to do anything. Now, you talked about 200 denarii not being able to feed people, much less 5 loaves of bread and a couple of fish. And by the way, you talk about loaves of bread. This is not like when you go to Walmart and you go to the bakery section and they got those like French loaves and you have to hold it like this because of how long they are. That's not the loaves that they're talking about. This was the type of bread that he could put and carry with him. These were probably about this big. And so he has some loaves of bread and a couple of fish. And Andrew says, he brings the lad and he says, look, we have this kid here. He's in the multitude. He's got a couple of fish and some bread. But again, he says the same thing in a different way that Philip said. What is this going to do among so many people? You see, Philip talked about it in a money stance of, look, even if we had this amount of money, I don't know if they had 200 denarii or not, I doubt it. But if we had this much money, we would not be able to feed crumbs to this amount of people. And here comes Andrew, Peter's brother, and he says, look, there's a kid that has a sack lunch, but obviously if 200 denarii aren't going to do anything, this definitely won't. And so you have 2 of Jesus' apostles, 2 of Jesus' disciples, and they're looking at this, and they're saying, this is what we don't have. They're looking at it, and instead of a stance of this is what we have, this is what we can bring, this is what we can offer, we'll figure it out. They bring these things up to Jesus to show what they don't have. You know, I can't help but think about the fact that I do the same thing. You know, I used to would read these accounts and be like, Andrew, you're literally bringing up the fact that you don't have enough to the creator of the universe. You're bringing this up to the guy that has literally performed miracles in front of your eyes, and you're saying this isn't going to work and I don't know what to do. Why can't you see that? You're focusing on what you don't have. And then when I look at my own life, I do the exact same thing. All of the things that I don't have are the things that I focus on. You know, I wish I was in this situation, financially speaking. I wish I was in this place of my job. I wish I was in this place with my school. I wish I had this car. I wish I could have this house. I wish I could have these things. I don't have any of that stuff. And because I don't have any of this stuff, I don't know what to do. I don't know if that's you, but that is me. But instead, and this is where the disciples are at too. You know, we don't have the money, we don't have the food, and even if we had the money, we don't know where we would go to get that much food. But instead, we got a couple of fish, we have a boys' lunch, and that's not enough, and I don't know what we're going to do. And so I often find myself, I'm going to have to move away from that. I often find myself in the same situation that the disciples find themselves in, and it's that I focus on what I don't have. But what Jesus is going to do with this is he's going to use this as an opportunity to grow the faith of his disciples. You know, you would think after a while the disciples would start understanding what they've really gotten involved in. But I would argue that they will not get it fully until probably Acts chapter 2. They're going to keep questioning things and not understanding things until around Acts chapter 2. But here you still have two of his disciples, and probably all of them are thinking the same thing. Literally, there is no way this is impossible. They were using human standards to measure the Son of God. But this is where it shifts from a man's lack of faith to Jesus said, though you doubt me, that you doubt my power. Now, I don't think that they were saying this to Jesus because, look, Jesus, we know you don't have the ability to do this, but I think that their mind was in the wrong place. I don't think their mind ever went to the fact that Jesus could fix this because they were so focused on what they didn't have that they didn't pay attention to what they did, and that is the power of God. But then you get verse 10. Then Jesus said, make the people sit down. Now there was much grass in the place, so the men sat down in number about 5,000. Okay, I want you to stop for a second. You have a multitude of people, and this is why I say it's more than 5,000, because the number of men was 5,000. That doesn't include women and children. The number you're really looking at, people estimate, is obviously not every man would be married, but at least half of them probably were. So that brings you to about 7,000. There were probably children there. Let's just say the average couple had 2 children because the Jews, more often than not, they would have children, and most of them had more than one. So let's just say that each one of them had 2. Okay, your numbers get closer to 10,000 and maybe more than that. But we just know that the men is 5,000. So you have a lot of people. And Jesus tells his disciples, you just stop. You can just see in your mind with me. You close your eyes, and I want you to see the disciples frantically trying to figure out how they're going to fix the situation. And Jesus says, listen, have the people sit down. And you can picture with me as Philip and Andrew and the others are walking through this multitude, having the people to sit, that they're questioning, what is Jesus going to do? We've already explained we don't have the money. We've already explained that we don't have the food. He's wanting everyone to sit down. What's he about to do? And Jesus took the loaves, this is verse 11, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to the disciples, and the disciples to those sitting down, and likewise of the fish, much as they wanted. So when they were filled, he said to his disciples, gather up the fragments that remain, so that nothing is lost. Therefore they gathered them up and filled 12 baskets with the fragments of the 5 barley loaves which were left over by those who had eaten. You know, God has this ability, and this being true for Father, Son, and the Spirit, that they take things that seem insignificant, that seem unworthy, that seem like it doesn't make sense why they're there, and they make powerful lessons out of it. You can go to the Old Testament, you can see a little shepherd boy sitting in the field, and he didn't seem like he would really ever amount to anything, so much so that when an important event was to take place, his father didn't even call him out of the field when the rest of his sons were there. And yet he became the greatest king that Israel would ever see. You see a guy that had a really big, he was not very eloquent, and he wasn't very confident in himself, and he didn't feel like he was enough for anything, and he would be the guy that God chooses, that you're going to lead my people out of the land of Egypt. You would see a people in general that, as far as financial situation is concerned, or by any other metric, this is not a powerful nation by any means, yet God would say, this is my people. All throughout the Bible, Old Testament, New Testament, what you'll see is God picks people, and he picks things that seem insignificant, that seem like nothing, and he uses that to prove the point. Even when Jesus picked his disciples, he picked some fishermen, he picked a tax collector, he picked a zealot. He picked a bunch of guys that, if you're wanting to pick a group of individuals that are religiously going to change the world, that is not the group that anyone else would have picked. And Jesus said, that's the group that's going to change the world. So here you have Jesus, this is not people, but this is things. And then you have a boy's lunch. This doesn't seem like anything, but Jesus is going to prove a point. He doesn't need something grand. He just needs something available. And what was available was 5 loaves and 2 fish. And that is what he gave. But notice what he did is he gave things, and then he broke it. There was a gratitude that he had before the miracle took place, because he knew that the Father had instilled in him the power to do this, but he was going to thank the Father for it. And he had faith in the Father that the outcome would be what he expected it to be. You see, Jesus had always, once he came to this earth, when the Word became flesh, and that flesh was named Jesus, Jesus always subjected himself to the will of the Father. Though he was still God in the flesh, what the Father said is what went. And so here he is about to present this miracle, and instead of just saying, God, the Father, make these loaves and fish multiply, instead he gave thanks. And then you see the miracle take place. Everyone received. And notice in verse 11, everyone got as much as they wanted. You know, 200 denarii would have got you a crumb. And what Jesus left you with was full. Not only did they each get enough to eat and sustain themselves, they ate until they were full. And then Jesus said, look, I want you to take up what's left, and what you have is 12 baskets. Every single one of the disciples had a basket that they brought out, and they started handing out food, and every single disciple brought back a basket full of loaves and fish. And so what you're seeing is that God's provision, Jesus' provision, was not merely adequate, it was abundant. Jesus was going to make a point with this physical food, and he was about to make a point spiritually, but he wanted them, if they could get it physically, then they were going to get it spiritually. He needed them to understand that, physically speaking, when I give you something, when I provide for you, it's not just going to be enough that you can be okay, that you're sustained, it's adequate, but it will be that you're full, that you will need nothing else, physically. And then he's going to start making the point spiritually. Now this is more so for his disciples, I would argue, than the 5,000. Because his disciples were the ones that lacked faith. I think probably when Jesus had that multitude sit down, I think they were expecting a miracle. I don't know what the disciples were expecting. From the way that they were bickering back and forth about what they were going to do, and complaining and worrying, I doubt that they knew what was going to happen. And I'm pretty sure the multitude probably expected it. But what you see is that Jesus was showing that even the smallest of things can be used by me to glorify God. But then you get what happens more oftentimes than not when Jesus would do these things. You've had the argument amongst the disciples about what needs to take place. How are we going to fix the situation? Jesus fixes the situation. He feeds the 5,000, and everyone knows what took place. It's not like Jesus had a caravan of people carrying loaves and fish that he was going to cater all of these people and he's going to feed all of these people. They knew when these baskets started getting passed around that Jesus, he did it again. And then you get verse 14. Then those men, when they had seen the sign that Jesus did, said, "This is truly the prophet who is to come into the world." The average Jew would have the first 5 books of the law memorized: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Almost every Jew after that, maybe not memorized, but would have an extremely good understanding of the prophets. Every Jew, of course, would have an incredible understanding of the books of history, but you would have the law memorized. History, that's your history, so of course you know that. And then the prophets, a lot of those guys, usually it was the Pharisees that had it memorized, but the average Jew would still have a great understanding of the prophets, and they watched it happen, and they remembered the prophecies that Micah and Isaiah and Jeremiah and every other prophet that prophesied, that said that these things were going to take place, that Zechariah talked about, that every single one of these prophets, they prophesied about one was going to come, and then we're going to perform these things, and we're going to do these things, and they said, this is him. Now, if you just stopped at verse 14, I mean, this is the outcome that Jesus wants. Jesus is going to use their physical needs as a way to show access to him as the Christ. But then you get verse 15. If you just stop at verse 14, you'd be okay. But I think this also is a time where these headings do us injustice, because you're going to see in verse 15, Jesus walks on the sea. Okay, and that will be something that Jim will talk about next week. But what you're going to see is really verse 15, that belongs with the first 14 verses, because therefore when Jesus perceived that they were about to come and to take him by force to make him king, he departed again to the mountain by himself alone. That belongs with this first part. Okay, so you've had, as we close, you've had this encounter of the multitude with Jesus, but more importantly, the disciples with Jesus, about who Jesus really is. When Jesus said, "I want you to follow me," I think there was a general understanding of what he was asking. But I don't think they got it. I know they didn't get it. Because here is the perfect opportunity for them to say, when Philip was asked, "Where are we going to buy bread?" for Philip to say, "We don't need to buy bread." But instead, you have the bickering, you have the worry, you have the anxiety of how are we going to fix this situation. You have Jesus fix the situation. He uses this as an opportunity to show that when God provides, he provides in full. Always. That's true physically and that's true spiritually as well. And then you have the multitude's reaction. They have the right thought that this really is the one that was prophesied about. This is him. This is the one we've been waiting for. This is the Messiah. And then they say, "All right, let's make him king." Because what did the Jews really want? They wanted a savior from Rome, not a savior from sin. And so they thought that this was their opportunity to overthrow the government, to overthrow them. If he can turn water to wine, if he can do this and that, if he can heal the sick, and if he can make 5 loaves of bread and a couple of fish that was in a boy's lunch, sustain 5,000 plus people, then that's the guy that I want us to lead in our conquest of Rome. But when Jesus realized that their heart was in the wrong place, he left. Now what do we draw from that this morning? Though Jesus obviously does not feed us physically today the way that he did there, that was a miracle. What he did show is that when God provides, he provides in full. And that's true spiritually, just you physically. I want to focus on the spiritual. You see, when Jesus came and he died on the cross, salvation looked differently than it did for the Jews. See, the Jews, the way their system worked, is they couldn't wash away sins, but instead they pushed it forward. That's all they did. Every year they'd push their sin forward for the next year, and then they'd have to push it forward again. But when Jesus came, he said, I'm going to wash that away. You remember, if you were here in Bible class, we were in Zechariah, remember that third vision. What did he do? Did he take off some of the garments off of Joshua the high priest, which represented the people? He took all of the dirty garments. When Jesus paid the price for sin, he paid in full. So maybe you're here this morning, you're not a Christian. Your sins have not been paid in full, because though Jesus did his part, you have to do something to access that salvation. We would love to study with you to show you what it means to become a Christian, to have your sins washed away. Or maybe you are a Christian, and maybe there's something in your life that you've done, and you want prayers of forgiveness, prayers of a righteous man, and it avails much. We just need some prayers of encouragement. You're going through a hard time. Whatever way we can help you this morning, we'd love to. If you come forward while we stand and while we sing.